Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning and welcome to Encounter. I'm your host today, Joe Sellepack, the Executive Director of the Broome County Council of Churches. One of the things that I often think about is the statement that if you don't learn from your history, it often repeats itself. What we are experiencing in many ways today in both our politics and in our social milieu, or the way that we are as a people, is directly related in a lot of ways to our history and to how we've addressed things like race, like slavery, and also how we've positioned ourselves post-Civil War in many ways in our country. So one of the things that we have today is an enduring legacy of something that we call the myth of the lost cause. It's something that came from the Civil War. How important is that myth of the lost cause to some of our current discussions about race and our understanding too of like the North and South divide?
Well, one way to look at it is sort of the way I introduced my Civil War class when I teach that course at Broome. I begin by telling my students that much of what the average American thinks they know about the Civil War actually comes from the Confederate perspective. I mean, we hear this old saw that the winners write the history books, but not always. and in this case, the Confederates or the former Confederates were incredibly effective at rewriting the history book to justify not only their actions in bringing on the Civil War, not only to justify, but also to totally reinterpret. But then also in the Reconstruction period, and then that followed the Civil War, and then after Reconstruction ended, to justify their actions, particularly the construction of the entire Jim Crow system. So the myth of the lost cause has an incredibly powerful and long-lasting legacy.
My guest today is Steve Call. He's a history professor at SUNY Broome, and today's Encounter guest. So thank you for being on Encounter today, Steve.
My pleasure.
So let's fill in the gaps a little bit. What do you mean, or what does historians, when historians use the term myth of the lost cause, what does that mean?
Well, the term itself comes from essentially the South changed the entire narrative of why the Civil War was fought. They changed it to one of glorification of what they were trying to do, which was to fight against an overbearing federal government, a federal government that was getting more and more powerful and that was threatening more and more the rights, the traditional rights that we think of when we use the term states' rights. That was one part of it, but the more nefarious part of it was that in order to shift the narrative from the actual cause to this idea that it was a noble fight against this overbearing federal power, they had to essentially dismantle the truth, which is that slavery was the overwhelmingly predominant cause of the Civil War. And so, for example, when I talk with people about this, I ask them, have you ever heard somebody say the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery? This is sort of the corollary that went with the myth of the lost cause, because what usually follows is a statement like, it was actually all about states' rights, or it was a fight against this overpowering federal government, federal power. And the truth of the matter is, especially if you go back for a number of decades, as the slavery issue got more and more divisive in American politics, the South dug in its heels more and more, defending slavery and insisting on both the need for slavery and the justifications for it, to the point where essentially, once they saw the rise of the Republican Party, which again, what led to the rise of the Republican Party, it was this controversy, not over ending slavery. That's another part of the myth, that the federal government wasn't really trying to destroy slavery, but in reality, what the Republican Party arose to try and stop was the spread of slavery. The South wanted to spread slavery into the territories, and many Northerners,
like Missouri and Kansas.
And before that, New Mexico, Utah.
Right.
Right, and as these issues became more and more controversial, the South was more determined, got more and more determined to spread slavery. The North became more and more determined to halt the spread of slavery. This leads to the rise of the Republican Party. And so when the Republicans not only captured the White House with Abraham Lincoln's election, but also a majority in the House and in the Senate, the South essentially saw that as the last straw, and then began the secession crisis. And
many of them succeeded before Lincoln even took office.
Yeah.
So it was something that occurred even though Lincoln had basically said that he was not going to abolish slavery.
Right, correct. In fact, after the election of 1860, there's essentially 4 months before the president is inaugurated and becomes the president. And in those 4 months, not only Lincoln, but the Republican Party in general was bending over backwards trying to reassure the South that they had no intention to destroy slavery where it existed. They only wanted to limit its spread, but that wasn't good enough. And
one of the other myths that kind of was prevalent within the South was that slaves were treated well, that there was no animosity between whites and blacks, that there was a very smooth kind of relationship between people of various races.
In fact, that became a long-standing part of the South's justification of slavery before the Civil War.
Right.
That slavery was not nearly the negative system that Northerners imagined it was. That slaves were actually happy, well treated, and in terms of the long-term nefarious consequences of all of this, part of their justification was that slaves were actually better off in slavery because they were incapable of taking care of themselves, and they essentially would just descend into all kinds of inappropriate behavior or self-destructive behavior if they were not kept in the supposedly humanitarian system of slavery. One of the things I do want to point out, because this is not a new argument that the myth of the lost cause was completely wrong about slavery as the cause of the Civil War. I want to point out probably the best way, if anybody in your audience wants to check this for themselves, I would say just go no farther than looking at the documents that the South produced to justify its secession. I mean, you were exactly right. Before Lincoln was even inaugurated, 7 states had left the Union. Lincoln hadn't even been able to do a single thing as president, and 7 states have seceded. But every state that seceded including a couple that, like Missouri and Kentucky, where some elements tried to get the state to secede. They produced a number of documents, secession documents, but also several supplemental documents explaining exactly why they are seceding.
Yeah.
And in every single one of these documents, the primary reason that they state is slavery. In fact, in all but one, that is the only cause they list. Texas mentioned a few things. They were upset that the federal government wasn't doing enough to suppress Native Americans. But other than that, everything else that was mentioned related to slavery. In fact, I one time was doing some research into the South Carolina convention that wrote their particular justification for slavery. And in the debates, somebody even stands up and says, you know, I've read your document, and all you're saying is slavery. You're just listing slavery as the cause. Aren't there some other issues? And he's immediately shouted down with, no, we want the world to know exactly why we are seceding. We don't want them to be confused about anything else. We don't want them to think that there's anything else going on here. It is slavery, and we want the world to know.
My guest today is Steve Call. He's a history professor at SUNY Broome. And we're talking about the myth of the lost cause as it relates to post-Civil War dialogue and how we describe what happened at during the Civil War, as well as why we went to war, and how did that kind of play out through Reconstruction, which I think was kind of interesting.
Yeah, and one of the things to remember, besides just that slavery had been the cause of the Civil War, well before the Civil War broke out, slavery actually served two very important purposes in the South. It was obviously a labor system that we're all familiar with, but something that's less familiar, well before the Civil War, the white South had become deathly afraid, terrified of their own slaves. And as a result, slavery was as important to them as a race control system. There were gangs that would patrol the highways and byways throughout the South and at night to ensure that slaves were not traveling the roads, not only to keep them from escaping, but to keep them from communicating from one plantation to another. There were a number of aspects of slavery that were as important at simply keeping these slaves subjugated and suppressed. And so when slavery is destroyed, not just abolished, I mean, the Civil War, the slavery had been mortally wounded by the war itself before the 13th Amendment was passed. But once slavery is destroyed, now the white South needs to replace slavery with some new form of system that would both provide the labor that slaves had previously performed, but also to keep the African American population subjugated. And in fact, this ultimately leads to first of all, the frustration of the federal Reconstruction policy. They are doing everything from legal machinations at the state level to the terror campaigns that we're familiar with the Ku Klux Klan and other similar groups. And then once they had frustrated the Reconstruction program and the federal government ends Reconstruction, then the South begins constructing what we call today the Jim Crow system.
Right.
And in fact, it's interesting that when people today think of Jim Crow, what they see is the part of Jim Crow that was actually meant to replace that race control system that slavery had been. I mean, segregation, the informal, routine humiliations of African Americans, the scourge of lynching, for example, was a very powerful tool. There were, in fact, often the lynchings were not actually, legal violations. They were more violations of the informal part of Jim Crow. This man had spoken offensively against, for example, the Emmett Till.
Right. Right.
Emmett Till was tortured to death for whistling at a white woman.
Right.
And that was in 1955. So, I mean, the legacy of not just the Jim Crow system, but the whole, the legacy of slavery that had led to the Jim Crow system had very long legs. It lasted right on into modern times.
One of the quotes that I came across when I was kind of doing some research on this is something from The Atlantic. There was an article that was done in 2021 just recently on the myth of the lost cause, and I thought it was kind of interesting. It said that Confederate history is family history as eulogy, in which loyalty takes precedence over truth.
You know, it's interesting because I was just reading something similar where essentially a defender of the myth of the lost cause, the modern defenders go by various terms, but one of them is neo-Confederates. And,
right.
A prominent neo-Confederate was arguing that history is not nearly as important as family.
Right.
And
I guess that's my question as far as like how that gets played out in Reconstruction, and as people were talking about themselves, there's a tendency to want to eulogize or to make or to let mom and dad off the hook, or grandma and grandpa off the hook.
Yeah.
We don't want to see them as racist. We want to see them as innocent somehow. And
also as ennobled.
Right.
Right. I mean, and essentially, there's an argument. I guess there's two parts of the myth of the lost cause. There's what they are arguing in favor of, that it was this noble effort, and then there was the things that they are trying to argue away, which is the role of slavery. And in this regard, they are trying to essentially emphasize the positive side of that. That is,
right.
My granddaddy or my great granddaddy or my family, my tradition was a noble. They were fighting a noble cause.
Right.
They do not want to see their ancestors sullied with this idea that the whole thing was to preserve slavery.
And it seems like that truth, like what that quote says, truth is lost in this. That we lose the facts by propaganda instead of it being one of the slave revolts. The largest slave revolt happened in Alabama. There was a number of African Americans that were at the time slaves, and they were revolting against their master, and they were trying to gain freedom. Now, in order to suppress that, a militia was formed. They killed, I don't know how many people. 55 is what they had at the. There's a plantation in Alabama that is the site of this whole thing, and they put 55. They have 55 skulls of black people that they put on posts lining the Mississippi River as a way of demonstrating to everyone what happens when slaves revolt.
Right.
Yeah. And we lose that history. That truth is then suppressed, and instead we get this narrative which basically says, what are you complaining about? Black people have never been treated poorly. Right.
Well, and in fact, on the truth part, I'm no psychologist, but I do know enough to know that a big part of this is cognitive dissonance.
Well, yeah.
I can't tell you how many times I have heard somebody trying to defend, either it's our heritage, and a sentence begins with something like, "My great granddaddy told me."
Right.
And you want to honor your great granddaddy,
Right.
and the wisdom that is handed down through the ages. And so when the wisdom that you got from your ancestors is saying one thing, but truth is saying something else, how do you reconcile it in your mind?
Well, and I think that's part of the issue. Like the larger issue is the myth of innocence, where we feel as if somehow, we have innocence within our own social milieu. Like there is no such thing as racism, or that black people are not complaining about their treatment, and that's not true. Mm-hmm. I remember reading an article in which a person said that white privilege itself is a myth, mm-hmm. and they're trying to cast a different narrative.
Right.
When in reality, when you throughout history, through our history, it's a demonstration, so to speak, of white privilege, and even the idea that somehow I can mythologize white privilege, or that we are mythologizing white privilege, is itself a right in itself. It proves the point, so to speak.
Right.
So the question is, like, how is this conversation still with us today, and how are we still enacting the same mythology, I guess?
Well, when you first of all, there is the fact that all this supposed heritage and wanting to honor your ancestors and wanting to honor your community and its history is essentially not only burying all this truth,
right,
but it is preventing us from dealing effectively with all that legacy, and then on top of it, you get the legacy of the Jim Crow system. I mean, some of the aspects of Jim Crow that we aren't as familiar with, the parts that were meant to replace slavery with a new labor control system, essentially kept.
One of the interesting things that I read said that we don't own slaves, we rent them now.
Well, yes, I mean,
yeah.
Some of the legal labor laws that applied only to African Americans are appalling to read about, and the collective consequence was that right up until fairly recently, the civil rights movement into the 1960s. The ancestors of these freed slaves were still living in abject poverty because of this long-term system that was a part of Jim Crow to replace the slavery as a labor system. And what that means, poverty just means that there are all kinds of opportunities that were lost.
Right.
There's also something that I think is still very pertinent to this day. That there was something of an accommodation between the white South in the 20th century and the early civil rights movement. For example, Booker T. Washington is often depicted as a concessionist, that he essentially sold out to the white South. But essentially, what the white South agreed to do to try to mollify or keep resistance among the African American population was itself very damaging in the long-term consequences. For example, part of not only was education segregated so that there were the white schools and the black schools, but essentially what was being taught in those schools was segregated as well. That essentially part of this accommodation was supposedly that we will allow you to have your schools, but we will only allow them to teach basic subjects, essentially utilitarian type subjects, reading and writing and arithmetic, but we won't teach, for example, the liberal arts. Well, why is that damaging?
Right.
Well, because it's the liberal arts that teach us how to think. And we want to keep our African American population effective as employees, as workers, but we don't want them thinking.
And voting. I mean, or when they put in place like reading requirements or any number of other requirements in order to keep people away from the polls.
Right. Right.
So there was like a whole, some of the questions that they would ask were, were things that the normal white person themselves couldn't answer.
Right, and that there, the poll officials had discretion of what questions they were to ask. So a white applicant comes forward, and it's something basic like, "Who's the president today?"
Right.
Whereas a black applicant would come forward, and it would be, explain in detail the functioning of the judicial system and all its various levels. I think a lot of us would have trouble answering that particular question. And the other thing too is that again, this problem is far deeper than most people realize. For example, we've talked about the myth of the lost cause, this sort of pseudo-historical narrative about what the Civil War was all about, right? Well, there's sort of a corresponding pseudo-history in the early 20th century, after the Jim Crow system had basically been fully implemented. A professor by the name of William Dunning at Columbia University essentially created a deeply influential historical narrative about Reconstruction, where the whole Reconstruction period and the federal Reconstruction policy were treated as basically the same sort of narrative of the overbearing federal authority coming in and doing more damage than good and trampling on rights and that sort of thing. But
that conversation is still with us today in many ways.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. And this Dunning School, because he had many grad students who carried on his work, and this became more or less the dominant historical narrative of Reconstruction well into the 1960s. And but a corollary to it, besides tearing down the legacy of federal Reconstruction policy, was the flip side of that, which essentially said that it was all misguided in the first place because African Americans were so inferior and so childlike that they never should have been entrusted with the vote to begin with, and therefore this current policy of segregation is perfectly legitimate. I mean, this gave an intellectual veneer to all of this.
My guest today has been Steve Call. Steve Call is a SUNY history professor. I want to thank you for being on Encounter today. And to all of our listeners and viewers, I wish you a great day. Be kind and gentle to each other.